exercise selection is right up there for you. So with so many options of exercises to do, there's so many, right? Just for chest, you can do bench press, you can do chest press machine, you can do dumbbells, you can do push-ups. How do you know if an exercise is good for you?
Yeah. Well, the reason I put exercise selection has been pretty high importance here is because, like, if you want to grow your chest, you got to choose an exercise that actually trains your pecs, right? So that's the main reason I put that as pretty high. I think that probably some people at the moment in the TikTok world and stuff probably overcomplicate exercise selection a bit, but it is something that you kind of got to think a little bit about. And then once you got some solid exercises, I think that gives you a really good base to go from. But I mean, the first thing is really, does it align with your primary goal? Which sounds kind of stupid when you put it that way, but honestly, I think sometimes people get a little bit lost in like, oh, this person's doing that exercise, maybe I should do this exercise and stuff. And really, you just got to think about, well, you know, if I'm training for something specific, I got to have exercises that align with that specific goal. If I'm trying to get stronger at something, then you must adhere to the principle of specificity, and you have to choose an exercise that matches that. So if you're a powerlifter, obviously, like probably at least half of your training volume should be in some variation of the 3 power lifts, as an example. If you're playing a sport on the side, you've got to think about that as well. What exercises am I going to choose there? For muscle growth, it's less about the specific movement and more about just trying to deliver mechanical tension and total work to the target muscles. And that's where you can start to get some generally good exercises. Like, you know, you give anybody a bench press, they're going to grow some chest muscles. But we're also thinking about stuff that's like, you know, what's time efficient, what's going to be suitable for the individual. So, you know, it's not so much about the specific movement, but it's more like what matches the person and their goals. And the first thing I think about when I'm trying to categorize like what might be a good exercise for me is just asking if it's stable enough and if it's highly loadable, because that then allows us to adhere to the principle of progressive overload. You know, if you can push hard without losing your balance, if you can do it without thinking too much about like cues in your head, if you've got like 5 or 6 different cues in your head to try and keep this exercise stable and the reps consistent, that's going to be a problem. So those things all become really important because you don't want coordination and instability to be a limiting factor for you. So if I have, let's say there's a new weird exercise that's popped up on TikTok or Instagram or something, and I want to evaluate this sort of unconventional exercise, I ask myself, like, could I potentially test my 1 rep max on this? If I could test a 1 rep max on it, then it gives me a good idea that, you know, it's probably okay. If you picture trying to do a 1 rep max on an exercise and it's like, shit, that could be like pretty dicey, it's maybe giving you a clue that there's something not so good about the stability demands or the setup or whatever it is. So that's a big thing for me, and I think that's probably where things like machines and support in general is pretty helpful. And again, that's not to say that free weights are not as good as machines or anything like that. Free weights are generally stable enough, but it's just something to sort of think about. And then from there, you can start to think about whether an exercise actually suits your biomechanics as well. So everybody's got slightly different structures, and the classic example is like if you've got really long femurs and you try and do a back squat, that's probably going to turn into a little bit more of a hip dominant movement. So you might be choosing a back squat to try and train your quads, but if you're having to bend over a lot to complete a full range of motion squat, it's probably going to turn more into a hip or lower back exercise. Whereas if you have shorter femurs, you're able to stay more upright, that could be an absolutely killer quad exercise. So, you know, a general squat pattern, generally very good for quads, but maybe a different variation of the squat pattern is better for you if you have longer legs or longer femurs compared to somebody else. So that's something else that we got to think about as well. And that kind of ties into also what sort of range of motion can you achieve with something. You know, again, like let's use a squat as an example. If you have a really deep hip socket, you might find that as you squat down, your femur just sort of bashes into the front of your hip joint earlier than someone else, and you can't get as deep. Whereas if you choose a different variation, maybe you can avoid that, and that might be a better exercise for you to do squats. So those are all the things that I start to think about when I'm assessing something for me personally. You know, and then you can sort of start to go along with things like, how does it fit into the rest of my program? You know, does this exercise complement the other movements I'm doing for this body part? Am I familiar enough with this movement to actually train hard on it, or is it going to take me a while to kind of build up the coordination to start pushing hard? Those sorts of things too. So those are all the things I think about.
Do you think about the term that RP Strength have popularized, the stimulus to fatigue ratio? Because you've touched on it, like, mostly, just you haven't said the phrase, let's say. You know, like, you've talked about, like, if it feels good for you, if it feels for your biomechanics, if it feels great for you, and if it fits your goal. But the stimulus to fatigue ratio is more so like when you do it, you know, is the muscle building stimulus that you feel, like how much it's hitting the target muscle, does that trump how much it may potentially, I don't know, impact your joints or make you feel discomfort?
Yeah, I think it's a little more complex than just saying, like, is it fatiguing or not? Like, is it giving me a good stimulus or not? Because you kind of got to think, again, with a compound movement, one of the reasons we do it is because one exercise can cover like 2 or 3 muscle groups. If you squat, you can get great glute stimulus, you can get great adductor, great quad stimulus, even a little bit of lower back and core from the isometric contraction. Whereas if you're on a leg extension, it's just training your quads, right? So, yes, okay, a squat is more fatiguing, but it's more fatiguing because you're using way more muscle and it's way more time efficient. You're getting like 3 in 1. So it gets a little bit more complex than just saying, well, this is a higher or low stimulus to fatigue ratio. I do think a bit about, like, what muscles am I trying to train here, and is this exercise actually allowing me to stimulate those muscles well? So again, if we're doing a squat, and I have some clients who specifically like, hey, I really want to build, say, my glutes, I could say, yeah, okay, a squat is an amazing glute exercise, but if it's giving them additional fatigue on their quads that they don't really care about having big quads, then I start to think, well, maybe it's not the best exercise for them. Maybe I should be doing things like hip thrusts or Romanian deadlifts a bit more, because the stimulus to fatigue ratio for that person is better. So yeah, I do think it's like the concept is really sound, but sometimes I think the application is a little bit too one-dimensional.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, because if you just keep using that as a guide, then all you'll be doing is chest flies, leg extension, calf raises.
Yeah, exactly.
And you'll just be Mr. Isolation, and then you won't get that bang for buck effect that you get with squats. So that's a really great point. And, you know, like, once again, because it is more fatiguing and it does recruit more muscle fiber, even though that is seen as a downside, I think, you know, not only does it train a lot of muscle groups, but it also has a greater ripple effect onto other exercises, which I really like. Like, you know, like with the leg extension, you're not necessarily going to get a stronger leg press or a stronger lunge or a stronger split squat, where with a squat, it's, you know, obviously they're completely different exercises, but you're going to get, I believe, more carryover because you're actually building more strength within that exercise, even though the stimulus to fatigue ratio is higher.
Yeah, I mean, that's something that I think about with hypertrophy training in general, is that it is a bit more flexible than other kinds of training in terms of, like, the principle of specificity. Like I mentioned before, like, if you want to get better at a back squat, you've got a back squat. But if you want to grow your quads, you can use a squat pattern, and they could all be, like, reasonably justifiable. But there is that secondary sort of point that you said of, what other physical qualities do I want to build? You know, for me personally, I care about growing muscle, but I also care about getting stronger. So for me, I'm going to choose something where I can build my squat pattern strength well, and it's also going to give me the hypertrophy that I want. And I think probably most people are like that as well. So it is worth thinking about that stuff too. So I totally agree with you on that.
Yeah, I think the exercise selection thing is also important to note. Or if you don't have an understanding, I think it's important to have that understanding of what squat patterns are, or what horizontal pushes are, horizontal pulls, vertical push, vertical pull.
Yes.
Because as trainers, you know, we talk about that day and night, and we can pull out all the examples in the world. But when you're writing your own program or have less of an understanding of what these exercises are, then that's when you fall into the trap of just looking at exercises as what they are and not for, let's say, what they represent. So I don't think we should dive into that, because it's a pretty, you know, if you don't know what it is, go search up, you know, vertical push-pull, horizontal push-pull, quad dominant, hip dominant, you know, lunge pattern, squat pattern, etc. And that will kind of start giving you a bit of x-ray vision into exercise selection. So you're not just saying, oh, leg extension equals quads and chest press equals chest. It's more so, chest press machine equals horizontal push machine, and then you can
Yep.
insert any other exercise in there if you don't have the gym equipment, etc.